The first gunshot tore through the still desert air, sending a flock of startled ravens skyward as Florence Taylor's wagon erupted into flames. It was 1873 in the unforgiving Arizona Territory, and as the second bullet splintered the wooden chest beside her, Florence knew that everything she had worked for over the past 3 years was about to vanish like water on hot sand. "Run, Florence." Her father shouted, his voice barely audible over the thundering hoofbeats approaching from the east. His weathered hand pushed her toward the rocky outcropping behind their homestead as he raised his own rifle in defense. Florence's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her skirts and fled, the sound of more gunfire echoing behind her. Tears blurred her vision as she scrambled up the rocky slope, her fingers bleeding as they grasped at sharp stones. She didn't look back until she reached the shelter of a large boulder, and by then, the smoke from their burning home billowed black against the azure sky. The band of raiders, 6 men on horseback, circled what remained of the Taylor homestead like vultures. Through watery eyes, Florence watched them ransack the wagon, overturn water barrels, and set fire to the small cabin her father had built with his own hands. Even from this distance, she could hear their raucous laughter as they destroyed everything. Her father lay motionless in the dust. Florence stifled a scream, pressing her fist against her mouth until she tasted blood. By nightfall, the raiders had gone, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins. Florence crept back down to what remained of her home, her legs barely supporting her weight. The desert night was growing cold, but she felt nothing as she knelt beside her father's body. "I am sorry, Pa," she whispered, closing his eyes with trembling fingers. She buried him at dawn, using a shovel that had somehow survived the destruction. The hard-packed earth resisted her efforts, as if reluctant to accept another body in this harsh land. When the grim task was complete, Florence surveyed what remained of their life together: charred timber, broken furniture, and the scattered remnants of their few possessions. With nothing left but the clothes on her back and her mother's locket around her neck, Florence turned west. The nearest town was Agua Caliente, a day's walk through desert terrain. With no water and no food, she started walking, the rising sun beating down on her uncovered head. By midday, her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her vision swam with heat and exhaustion, making the distant mountains dance like spectral figures. Florence's steps faltered, then failed entirely as she collapsed to her knees in the burning sand. "Just a moment's rest," she murmured, though there was no one to hear. Just a moment. She didn't know how long she lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness when the sound of approaching hoofbeats roused her. Fear jolted through her veins had the raiders returned to finish what they'd started. Florence tried to rise, to run, but her limbs refused to obey. Instead of the violent men who had destroyed her home, a single rider appeared on the horizon. He approached cautiously, the brim of his hat pulled low against the sun. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, snorted as they drew near. "Madam," the man's voice was deep but gentle. "Madam, can you hear me?" Florence tried to speak, but her parched throat produced only a rasp. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing the distance between them with long strides. He knelt beside her, shading her from the merciless sun. "Here now," he said, uncorking a canteen. "Small sips, if you please." The water was warm but felt like heaven against her cracked lips. Florence drank gratefully, looking up at her rescuer through half-lidded eyes. He was young, not much older than her 22 years, with a strong jawline softened by concern. Dust from the trail covered his clothes, but couldn't disguise their quality. This was no ordinary drifter. "Jack Aldridge," he introduced himself, steadying her as she attempted to sit up. "Most folks call me Jack. Florence Taylor," she managed, her voice still raw. "My father and I, our homestead." The memories crashed back like a flash flood, and Florence's words dissolved into sobs. Jack Aldridge said nothing, simply offering his canteen again and keeping his steady hand on her shoulder. When her tears subsided, Florence wiped her face with her sleeve, embarrassment heating her cheeks despite her exhaustion. "I apologize, Mr. Aldridge." "It's just that no need for apologies, Miss Taylor," he interrupted gently. But we need to get you out of this sun. Can you ride?" Florence nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain. Jack helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as he led her to his horse. "This is Rusty," he said, patting the stallion's neck. "He's strong enough to carry us both to Agua Caliente." With surprising ease, Jack lifted Florence onto the saddle before mounting behind her. One arm encircled her waist securely while the other held the reins. Florence stiffened at the unfamiliar closeness, but as they began to move, exhaustion overcame propriety and she found herself leaning back against his solid chest. "Rest if you can," Jack said, his breath warm against her ear. "We'll be in town before sundown." Florence tried to stay alert, to memorize the terrain in case she needed to find her way back, but the rhythmic gait of the horse and the safety of Jack's arm around her proved too much. She drifted into uneasy sleep, dreaming of fire and her father's voice. She woke with a start as Rusty's pace changed, transitioning from a steady trot to a gentle walk. Buildings appeared through her bleary vision, wooden structures with false fronts, hitching posts, and a water trough where several horses drank deeply. "Agua Caliente," Jack announced. "Not much to look at, but they've got a doctor and a decent boarding house." Florence straightened, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance and the impropriety of arriving in town held in a stranger's arms. "Mr. Aldridge, I have no money to pay for such things." Jack guided Rusty toward a two-story building with a sign proclaiming it Mather's Boarding House and Hot Springs. "Don't worry about that now," he said. "Let's get you settled first." A plump woman with graying hair hurried out as Jack helped Florence dismount. Her initial smile of welcome faded as she took in Florence's condition. "Mercy, child, what's happened to you?" The woman turned accusatory eyes to Jack. "Mr. Aldridge, what's the meaning of this?" "Found her collapsed about 15 miles east, Mrs. Mathers," Jack explained, keeping a supportive hand under Florence's elbow. "Her homestead was raided. She needs a room and probably the doctor." Mrs. Mathers' expression softened immediately. Of course, bring her inside." She bustled ahead of them, calling for hot water and clean linens. Florence found herself guided to a small but clean room on the second floor. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood against one wall, a washstand and mirror against the other. After the scorching desert and the devastation of her home, it seemed impossibly luxurious. "I'll fetch Dr. Wilson," Jack said from the doorway as Mrs. Mathers helped Florence to the bed, "and then we can talk about what happened if you're feeling up to it." Florence nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers after the brutality she had witnessed. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking. After Jack left, Mrs. Mathers helped Florence remove her dust-caked dress and wash away the grime of her ordeal. The older woman clucked sympathetically at the scratches and bruises that covered Florence's arms and legs. "Poor lamb," she murmured, applying salve to the worst of the cuts. "What kind of monsters would do such a thing?" Florence closed her eyes, seeing again the men who had destroyed everything. "I don't know who they were," she admitted. "They came without warning." Dr. Wilson arrived shortly after, a balding man with spectacles and gentle hands. He examined Florence thoroughly, declared her suffering from heat exhaustion and minor injuries, and prescribed rest and plenty of fluids. "She'll need proper food too," he told Mrs. Mathers. "Nothing too rich at first, broth and bread to start." After the doctor left, Mrs. Mathers brought a tray with chicken broth, fresh bread, and tea. Florence ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that just hours ago she had believed she might die in the desert. Mr. Aldridge paid for a week's lodging, Mrs. Mathers informed her as she collected the empty dishes. "Said to tell you not to worry about a thing until you're stronger." Florence frowned. "I can't accept such charity. Once I'm well, I'll find work to repay him," Mrs. Mathers smiled knowingly. "Jack Aldridge doesn't offer charity, child. If he's helping you, it's because he believes it's the right thing to do." She patted Florence's hand. "Rest now. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about the future." Despite her intentions to stay awake and plan her next steps, Florence fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. She dreamed of her father, of their little farm, and of raiders with faceless heads who laughed as everything burned. She woke with tears on her cheeks, disoriented by the unfamiliar room. Pale morning light filtered through lace curtains, and for a moment Florence couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then it all came flooding back: the attack, her father's death, the desperate journey through the desert, and Jack Aldridge's timely arrival. Florence sat up slowly, testing her strength. Her body ached, but the dizziness and confusion of heat exhaustion had receded. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Mather's entrance with a breakfast tray. "Good morning, dear. You look much improved." Florence managed a small smile. "I feel better, thank you. Mr. Aldridge asked to see you when you're up to receiving visitors, Mrs. Mathers said as she set the tray across Florence's lap. "He's been quite concerned." Florence smoothed her hair self-consciously. "I'd like to thank him properly, perhaps after I've eaten." Mrs. Mathers nodded approvingly. "I'll let him know, and I've laid out a dress for you, one of my daughters. She's married now and living in Tucson." She indicated a simple blue calico hanging on the wardrobe door. "It might be a bit large, but it's clean." After breakfast, Florence washed and dressed in the borrowed clothing. The dress was indeed too big, but a belt cinched at the waist made it manageable. She had just finished braiding her hair when another knock sounded. Jack Aldridge stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking considerably more presentable than he had the day before. His brown hair was neatly combed, and his clean shirt and vest spoke of a man of some means. "Miss Taylor," he greeted her with a slight bow, "it's good to see you on your feet." "Thanks to you, Mr. Aldridge," Florence replied. "I don't know how to express my gratitude." Jack shifted, seemingly uncomfortable with her thanks. "No need for that. Anyone would have done the same." He gestured toward the stairs. "If you're feeling up to it, perhaps we could talk in the parlor. It's more comfortable than standing in the hallway." The boarding house parlor was modest but welcoming, with several horsehair sofas and chairs arranged around a stone fireplace. Despite the warm day, a small fire burned, taking the chill from the room. Jack waited until Florence was seated before taking a chair opposite her. "Miss Taylor, I hope you don't think me forward, but I'd like to understand what happened to you. Sheriff Daniels should be informed if there are raiders operating in the area." Florence clasped her hands tightly in her lap, struggling to maintain composure as she recounted the events of the previous day. Jack listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim as she described the attack and her father's murder. "Did you recognize any of the men?" he asked when she finished. Florence shook her head. "They wore bandanas over their faces, but they knew what they were looking for." "And what was that?" "Our land deed." Florence's voice hardened. "My father spent his life savings to buy that land. We were going to grow cotton, maybe raise some cattle eventually." Her eyes filled with tears. "They killed him for a piece of paper." Jack leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Miss Taylor, Florence, I'm so sorry for your loss, but I need to ask, did they find the deed?" "I don't know. Everything was burning when I came back." She brushed away a tear. "Does it matter now? The land is worthless without capital to develop it, and I have nothing left." "It matters," Jack said firmly. "Land disputes in the territory often turn violent, but usually there's more to it than appears. Your father's property, where exactly was it located?" "About 15 miles east, as you said, near Rattlesnake Creek." Jack's expression changed subtly. "The north or south bank?" "North," Florence replied, puzzled by his interest. "Why does that matter?" Instead of answering directly, Jack rose and crossed to the window, looking out at the dusty main street of Agua Caliente. "Because Rattlesnake Creek marks the boundary of the proposed railway line. Any land along the north bank just became very valuable." Florence stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. "You think someone wanted our land for the railway?" "It's possible." Jack turned back to face her. "There are men who'd stop at nothing to get their hands on property that might yield a profit." "Men like who?" Florence demanded, anger flaring through her grief. "I want to know who killed my father." Jack hesitated. "I can't make accusations without proof, but I know someone who might help us find out." He crossed back to Florence, taking the seat beside her this time. "Florence, I'd like to help you if you'll allow it." The intensity in his blue eyes made Florence momentarily forget her sorrow. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I know enough," Jack said quietly. "I know you survived something that would break most people. I know you buried your father and walked miles through desert heat rather than give up." His hand moved as if to cover hers, then withdrew. "And I know what it's like to lose everything and have to start again." Florence searched his face, finding only sincerity. "What do you propose?" "First, we talk to Sheriff Daniels. Then, if you're strong enough, we ride out to your homestead and see if there's anything to salvage, including that land deed if it survived. And then," Jack's expression hardened, "then we find the men responsible and make sure justice is served." Florence considered his words. The proper thing would be to thank him for his concern but decline his assistance. A young, unmarried woman had no business embarking on such a venture with a man she barely knew, but propriety had died with her father, burned in the flames of their homestead. All that remained was a daughter's grief and a growing desire for justice. "When do we start?" she asked. The sheriff's office was a small adobe building on the east end of town. Sheriff Thomas Daniels, a barrel-chested man with a salt and pepper mustache, listened gravely as Florence recounted the attack on her homestead. His weathered face revealed nothing, but his fingers drummed steadily on the desk as she spoke. "Mighty sorry for your trouble, Miss Taylor," he said when she finished. "Losing your pa that way, it's a hard thing." He glanced at Jack, who stood by the window, "but I'm not sure what you expect me to do about it." "Your job, perhaps?" Jack suggested, his tone carefully neutral. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Now see here, Aldridge, my jurisdiction ends at the town limits. What happens out in the territory is federal business." "Meaning you won't do anything," Florence said flatly. Daniels sighed. "Meaning I can't do much. I'll send telegrams to neighboring towns, ask if anyone's seen a gang matching your description. But 6 men with covered faces, that could be anyone." "What about the land deed?" Jack pressed. "If someone's trying to grab property along the proposed railway line, that narrows the field considerably." A flicker of something discomfort, guilt, crossed the sheriff's face. "That's speculation. Besides, even if the deed survived, it wouldn't matter much without your father to claim the land." He turned sympathetic eyes to Florence. "Miss Taylor, my advice is to put this behind you. Take whatever charity the good folks of Agua Caliente offer, then move on. Maybe head to Tucson or Phoenix, bigger towns with more opportunities for a young lady." Florence felt heat rising to her face. "My father was murdered, Sheriff. Our home was destroyed, and you're suggesting I just move on?" "I'm suggesting you be practical," Daniels countered. "What's done is done. No amount of justice will bring your pa back." "Perhaps not," Jack interjected smoothly, placing a calming hand on Florence's arm. "But it might prevent the same thing happening to someone else's father." He pulled Florence gently toward the door. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff. We'll let you know if we discover anything that might assist your investigation." Outside, Florence exploded. "That man has no intention of investigating anything. How can he call himself a lawman?" "SHH," Jack cautioned, guiding her away from the sheriff's office. "Daniels may not be eager to help, but we don't want him actively working against us either." Florence took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "You don't seem surprised by his attitude." "I'm not," Jack admitted. "Small town sheriffs often find it healthier to look the other way when powerful interests are involved." "And are powerful interests involved?" Jack's expression was grim. "I believe so. The railway means money, lots of it. Land that was worthless scrub a year ago is now prime real estate. Men have killed for far less." They walked in silence for a moment, the bustling activity of Agua Caliente's main street continuing around them. Florence was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. A young woman in an ill-fitting borrowed dress walking alongside one of the town's more prosperous citizens. "So what now?" she finally asked. "Now we get supplies," Jack decided. "If you're feeling strong enough, we'll ride out to your homestead tomorrow at first light." "I'm strong enough," Florence insisted, though her legs still felt wobbly from her ordeal. "But Mr. Aldridge, Jack, please." "Jack," she corrected herself. "I have no money for supplies or anything else, and while I appreciate your generosity, I can't keep accepting your charity." Jack stopped walking and turned to face her. "It's not charity, Florence. Consider it an investment in justice." He hesitated, then continued more quietly. When I was 16, my family lost everything in a land swindle back east. My father couldn't bear the shame he took his own life. My mother followed within a year. Florence's anger gave way to compassion. I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago, Jack said, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. But I never forgot the lesson. There are men in this world who will take whatever they want if no one stands against them. I've spent my life making sure they don't always win. Is that why you came west? Jack nodded. I made my fortune in California during the gold rush not by mining but by supplying the miners. Now I invest in legitimate opportunities that help build communities. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, including railways when they're honestly run. Florence studied him, seeing beyond his handsome features to the determination beneath. So this is personal for you. Yes, Jack admitted, but that doesn't make it any less right. Their eyes held for a long moment before Florence nodded. All right, we'll go tomorrow. But I insist on repaying you eventually for everything. Jack's smile deepened, transforming his serious face. I've no doubt you will, Miss Taylor. You strike me as a woman who keeps her promises. They spent the remainder of the day gathering supplies, food, water, ammunition for the rifle Jack insisted on bringing, and basic tools in case they needed to search through the rubble of the homestead. By evening, Florence was exhausted, her still recovering body protesting the day's activities. She retired early to her room at the boarding house, but sleep proved elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father falling, heard the raiders' laughter, smelled the acrid smoke of her burning home. A soft knock startled her from her dark thoughts. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders over her nightgown, Florence opened the door a crack to find Jack standing in the hallway. I apologize for disturbing you, he said quickly, but I thought you might want this for tomorrow. He held out a leather holster containing a small revolver. It's a .32 caliber, easier to handle than a full-sized gun but effective enough at close range. Florence hesitated only briefly before accepting the weapon. You think we'll need this? I hope not, Jack replied, but hoping isn't the same as being prepared. He stepped back. I'll meet you downstairs at dawn. Try to get some rest. Florence closed the door, placing the revolver on the nightstand. Its presence was both comforting and frightening, a tangible reminder that the danger might not be over. Despite her anxiety, exhaustion eventually claimed her, and Florence fell into a dreamless sleep. She woke before dawn, dressing quickly in the borrowed blue dress and a sturdy pair of boots Mrs. Mathers had found for her. Jack was already waiting in the parlor, 2 cups of steaming coffee on the table before him. He wore riding clothes and a gun belt, looking every inch the capable frontiersman rather than the businessman he claimed to be. Mrs. Mathers packed us some food, he said by way of greeting, pushing one of the coffee cups toward her. And I've saddled Rusty and a mare from the livery for you. She's gentle but sure-footed, good for desert terrain. Florence sipped the hot coffee gratefully. You've thought of everything. I try to, Jack replied with a small smile. It's a habit that's kept me alive so far. They set out as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern mountains. Florence rode slightly behind Jack, getting accustomed to her borrowed mount. The mare, a dappled gray named Dove, seemed content to follow Rusty's lead, giving Florence time to observe their surroundings. Agua Caliente sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by rocky hills and desert scrubland. As they rode east, the terrain became increasingly rugged, with towering saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against the brightening sky. How far is it to your homestead? Jack asked after they'd been riding for about an hour. Another hour, maybe less, Florence replied, squinting against the sun. There's a rock formation shaped like a reclining man just before you reach Rattlesnake Creek. Our land starts just beyond it. Jack nodded, adjusting his hat against the glare. Tell me about your father. What brought you two out here? Florence smiled sadly at the memory. Pa was always chasing the next opportunity. After my mother died when I was 12, he became restless. We moved from Missouri to Kansas, then to Colorado. She patted Dove's neck absently. When he heard about land opening up in Arizona territory, he was convinced it would be our chance to finally put down roots. And you, did you share his dream? Florence considered the question. I wanted him to be happy. After we lost Ma, that became my purpose, helping Pa find his place in the world. She sighed. I never imagined his search would end like this. It hasn't ended, Jack said firmly. Not as long as you're here to carry it forward. Florence wasn't sure how to respond to that. Part of her wanted to believe she could somehow fulfill her father's vision, but the practical side knew that a single woman with no resources had few options in this harsh territory. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun climbed higher, bringing with it the full heat of the Arizona day. Florence was grateful for the canteen Jack had provided, though she rationed the water carefully. There, she said eventually, pointing to a distinctive rock formation in the distance. The sleeping man. Our land is just beyond. Jack slowed Rusty's pace, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. We should approach cautiously. If the raiders had interest in your land, they might have posted someone to watch it. Florence's heart quickened at the thought. Do you really think they'd come back? If they were after the deed and didn't find it, they might, Jack replied. Let's leave the horses here and proceed on foot. It'll be easier to stay out of sight. They dismounted and secured the horses in the shade of a large boulder. Jack checked his revolver before tucking it back into his holster. Stay close to me, he instructed. And remember, if there's trouble, your safety comes first. Land can be reclaimed, but lives can't. Florence nodded, though privately she thought of her father's grave and wondered if Jack would be so philosophical if it had been his family destroyed. They approached the homestead from the west, using the natural contours of the land for cover. As they crested a small rise, Florence's breath caught in her throat. The destruction looked even worse in the harsh light of day. Charred timber where their cabin had stood, the blackened skeleton of their wagon, personal belongings scattered and broken across the dusty ground. "Oh, Pa," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Jack touched her arm gently. "I don't see anyone, but let me check the area before we go down there." He moved with surprising stealth for a businessman, circling the perimeter of the homestead with his revolver drawn. Florence watched anxiously from their hiding place, every sense alert for danger. But the only movement came from a pair of desert ravens picking through the debris. Finally, Jack motioned for her to join him. Florence picked her way down the slope, her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross marking her father's grave. She knelt beside it, brushing dust from the marker. "I'll find who did this," she promised softly, "and they'll pay for taking you from me." Jack gave her a moment of privacy before approaching. "We should search what's left," he said gently. "The deed might have survived if it was in a metal box or buried somewhere." Florence nodded, rising to her feet with newfound determination. Pa kept important papers in a tin box under a floorboard in the cabin. It might still be there under the ashes. They worked methodically, shifting debris and searching through the ruins. The heat was oppressive, and soon they were both covered in soot and sweat. Florence's hands became raw from digging through the rubble, but she ignored the pain, driven by the need to find some remnant of her former life. It was Jack who eventually unearthed the tin box, its lid warped from heat but the contents largely intact. "Florence," he called, "I think I found it." She rushed to his side as he pried open the container. Inside were several documents: the deed to the land, her parents' marriage certificate, her mother's death certificate, and a small leather pouch. "The deed," Florence breathed, carefully unfolding the singed paper. "It's still legible." Jack examined it over her shoulder. "This confirms what I suspected. Your land borders Rattlesnake Creek for nearly half a mile, prime territory for a railway crossing." Florence opened the leather pouch, gasping when gold coins spilled into her palm. "Pa's savings," she murmured. "He must have hidden them before the attack." "Not a fortune," Jack observed, counting quickly, "but enough to give you a fresh start." Florence closed her fingers around the coins, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't destitute after all. She had her land worthless, though it might be without her father's vision and means to survive until she decided what to do next. "We should go," Jack said, glancing at the sun now high overhead. "It's not safe to linger here." Florence nodded, taking a final look at her father's grave. "I'll come back," she promised silently. "When this is over, I'll come back and make this land what you dreamed it could be." They were halfway back to their horses when Florence spotted them dust clouds on the eastern horizon, moving rapidly in their direction. "Jack," she whispered urgently. "Someone's coming." Jack grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a cluster of rocks. "Quickly, we need to hide." They reached the shelter of the rocks just as riders appeared in the distance, 5 men on horseback, approaching the homestead at a gallop. Even from this distance, Florence recognized their silhouettes. "It's them," she hissed. "The raiders who killed my father." Jack's expression hardened as he drew his revolver. "Stay down. If they spot us, run for the horses. Don't wait for me." Florence clutched the tin box to her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the raiders would hear it. Through a gap in the rocks, she watched as the men dismounted and began searching the ruins, their movements agitated. "Barton's gonna be furious," one of them shouted. "You said the deed would be here." "It was," another replied defensively. "Old man must have hidden it better than we thought, or someone's already been here," a third man suggested, kicking at the disturbed ashes where Jack had uncovered the tin box. Florence felt Jack tense beside her. His finger hovered over the trigger of his revolver, but he made no move to confront the raiders. They were outnumbered, and outgunned. A confrontation now would be suicide. The men continued their search, growing increasingly frustrated as they found nothing. Finally, the apparent leader, a tall man with a distinctive red bandana, signaled for them to mount up. "We'll have to tell Barton the deed's lost," he declared. "Maybe he can still force the sale without it." "What about the girl?" one of the others asked. "She's still out there somewhere." The leader spat on the ground. "She's probably dead in the desert, and if not, who'd believe her over Barton? He practically owns Judge Whitley." Florence felt rage building inside her as she listened to them discuss her father's murder and her own presumed death with such callousness. Her hand moved to the small revolver Jack had given her, but he placed a restraining hand over hers. "Not yet," he whispered. "We need to be smart about this." The raiders mounted up and rode away, heading back the way they had come. Only when they were specks on the horizon did Jack relax his vigilance. "Barton," Florence said through clenched teeth. "They mentioned someone named Barton. Do you know who that is?" Jack's expression was grim. "Victor Barton. He owns the largest cattle operation in the territory and has investments in just about everything else, including the railway company." He helped Florence to her feet. "He's also on the territorial council and has the ear of the governor. So he's powerful," Florence concluded, "and connected." "Very," Jack agreed. "If he's behind this, taking him down won't be easy." He studied her face carefully. "Florence, this changes things. Barton isn't some common criminal. He has money, influence, and men willing to kill for him." Florence lifted her chin defiantly. "Does that mean we should give up? Let my father's murderers go unpunished?" "No," Jack said firmly. "It means we need to be smarter than they are. We can't fight Barton with guns, not directly, but there are other ways to bring a man like that to justice." "How?" "Evidence," Jack replied. "Proof that connects him to the attack on your homestead, something that even his friends in high places can't ignore." Florence considered this. "The deed is evidence that my father owned the land legally, and we heard his men mention his name." "It's a start," Jack acknowledged, "but not enough. We need someone on the inside, someone who can testify to Barton giving the orders." "One of those raiders," Florence realized. "We need to turn one of them against Barton." Jack nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Exactly, and I think I know which one to target." He gestured for Florence to follow him back to the horses. "The youngest one, the one who seemed nervous. He's not as hardened as the others. With the right pressure, he might be persuaded to talk." Florence felt a flicker of hope as they mounted their horses. Perhaps justice was possible after all. "We should head back to town," Jack said as they turned west. "I need to send some telegrams, and you should rest. Tomorrow we'll start building our case against Barton." As they rode, Florence found herself studying Jack's profile against the desert landscape. He was risking much to help her, a woman he barely knew, with nothing to offer in return. The question that had been nagging at her since he first proposed helping her finally worked its way to her lips. "Why are you doing this, Jack? Really?" she asked. It can't just be because of what happened to your family. There must be more. Jack was silent for so long that Florence thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. 6 months ago, I was negotiating with the railway company to establish a depot in Agua Caliente. It would have meant prosperity for the town, jobs for its people. But then Barton stepped in, insisting the route should go through his land instead, land that mysteriously expanded overnight to include several key properties. He stole them, Florence guessed, like he tried to steal ours. Yes, Jack confirmed, but I couldn't prove it. The previous owners either disappeared or suddenly claimed they'd sold willingly. His hands tightened on the reins. I knew Barton was behind it, but without evidence, there was nothing I could do. So I'm not the first, Florence murmured. No, Jack agreed. But you might be the last if we can stop him. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense. That's why I'm helping you, Florence, because you have what no one else did, the courage to stand up to him and the evidence to make it stick. Florence felt something shift between them in that moment, a connection deeper than shared purpose. This man understood her pain and her determination because he carried similar burdens. In his eyes, she saw not pity but respect, and it kindled a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the desert heat. We'll stop him, she said with newfound conviction. Together. Jack smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. Yes, he agreed. I believe we will. They reached Agua Caliente as the sun was setting, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and pink. Jack insisted on escorting Florence to the boarding house before attending to his other business. Lock your door tonight, he advised as they stood on the front porch. If Barton has spies in town, word of your survival might reach him soon. Florence nodded, suddenly exhausted as the day's events caught up with her. Will I see you tomorrow? First thing, Jack promised. We have plans to make. She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the dying light. Only when he turned the corner did Florence enter the boarding house, the tin box clutched tightly under her arm, proof of her past and, perhaps, key to her future. Mrs. Mathers fussed over Florence's soot-stained appearance, insisting on drawing a bath and serving a hot meal. Florence accepted the kindness gratefully, too tired to maintain her usual independence. Later, clean and fed, she sat on her bed and carefully examined the contents of the tin box once more. The deed confirmed what Jack had said: the Taylor property included prime frontage along Rattlesnake Creek. In the margin, her father had sketched plans for irrigation channels to support cotton fields' dreams now reduced to ash. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Florence tensed, remembering Jack's warning about locking her door. "Who is it?" she called, reaching for the small revolver. "Just me, dear," Mrs. Mathers' voice replied. "I've brought you some tea and a visitor." Florence opened the door cautiously to find the landlady accompanied by a young woman about her own age. The stranger was petite with dark hair and intelligent eyes that assessed Florence quickly. "This is Lucia Jimenez," Mrs. Mathers explained. "She works for the newspaper and wanted to meet you." Florence hesitated, uncertain about speaking to a reporter. Jack had cautioned discretion until they had a plan. Seeing her reluctance, Lucia stepped forward. "Mr. Aldridge sent me," she said quietly. "I'm a friend. May I come in, Mrs. Mathers, sensing the need for privacy, set down the tea tray and withdrew with a murmured good night. Florence closed the door behind her, studying the younger woman warily. "How do you know Jack?" she asked. Lucia smiled slightly. "My brother Miguel works for him. Jack helped us establish the newspaper 3 years ago when no one else would loan money to Mexicans." She sat in the chair by the window, her movements graceful but purposeful. "He trusts me and you can too." Florence relaxed slightly. "Why did he send you?" "Because we need allies and I have information that might help." Lucia's expression grew serious. "Victor Barton has been systematically acquiring land along the proposed railway route for the past year. Most sales appear legitimate on paper, but there are rumors." "More than rumors," Florence interjected. "His men murdered my father and burned our home." Lucia nodded grimly. "I believe the stories were true but had no proof. Now, perhaps we do." She leaned forward intently. Jack says you have the deed to your land and witnessed Barton's men returning to search for it. Yes, Florence confirmed, but Jack said we need someone who can testify that Barton ordered the attack. That's where I can help, Lucia said. I know the men who work for Barton. The young one you described. His name is Evan Cole. He's new to Barton's crew, took the job out of desperation after his family's farm failed last winter. Florence's pulse quickened. Do you think he might turn against Barton? Possibly, Lucia conceded. Especially if he believes it's his only option. She poured tea for them both, her movements precise. Jack asked me to tell you that he's arranged a meeting with Judge Foster tomorrow. Judge Foster, not Judge Whitley. Lucia's lips curved in a knowing smile. Whitley is Barton's puppet. Foster is from the Federal Circuit Court. He answers to Washington, not territorial politics. He's honest, and more importantly, he has the authority to issue warrants even against someone as powerful as Barton. Hope flared in Florence's chest. So if we can convince this Evan Cole to testify, then we have a chance of bringing Barton to justice, Lucia finished. But it won't be easy, and it certainly won't be safe. Florence thought of her father, of his dreams for their land and his violent end. Nothing worth doing is ever easy, she said quietly, or completely safe. Lucia studied her with newfound respect. Jack was right about you, she observed. You have courage. The comment brought a flush to Florence's cheeks. He spoke of me. He said you were remarkable, Lucia replied, a hint of mischief in her dark eyes. That's not a word Jack Aldridge uses lightly. Florence wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she changed the subject. How do we approach Evan Cole? If he's one of Barton's men, he won't exactly welcome us with open arms. Leave that to Jack, Lucia advised. He has a plan. Your job is to be ready to testify about what happened at your homestead. She rose to leave. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging. After Lucia departed, Florence lay awake for a long time, turning over recent events in her mind. In the span of 2 days, she had lost everything, nearly died, and now found herself allied with strangers against one of the most powerful men in the territory. It seemed almost unreal, like something from the dime novels her father used to read aloud on winter evenings. Yet the grief in her heart was real enough. So was the determination to see justice done. And so, increasingly, was the warmth she felt when she thought of Jack Aldridge, a man who had saved her life and now risked his own to help her. Stop that foolishness, she chided herself. The man is being kind, nothing more. But even as she drifted into sleep, Florence couldn't quite banish the memory of Jack's smile when he'd said they would stop Barton together. Morning brought clouds gathering on the western horizon, unusual for this time of year and promising rare summer rain. Florence dressed carefully in the blue calico, wishing she had something more presentable for a meeting with a federal judge. Her appearance was the least of her concerns, she reminded herself. What mattered was her testimony. Jack waited for her in the boarding house parlor, engaged in quiet conversation with Lucia. He rose when Florence entered, and something in his expression made her heart beat faster. You look well, he said. How did you sleep? Better than expected, Florence replied truthfully. The nightmares that had plagued her the previous night had receded, replaced by a determined focus on the day ahead. Good. Jack gestured to the street outside. Judge Foster is meeting us at my office in half an hour. Lucia has been explaining what we know about Evan Cole. They walked through town, Jack setting a pace that allowed Florence to keep up easily despite her still recovering strength. Agua Caliente was fully awake now, its streets busy with morning commerce. Florence noticed the curious glances directed their way, a reminder that in small towns, nothing went unobserved for long. Will people know why we're meeting the judge? She asked quietly. No, Jack assured her. Foster is discreet. As far as anyone knows, he's in town to discuss legal matters related to the railway. Jack's office was located above the town's only bank, a solid brick building that stood in stark contrast to the wooden structures surrounding it. A brass plaque beside the door read simply, J. Aldridge Investments. Inside, the office was tastefully appointed with solid furniture and shelves of leather-bound books. A large desk dominated the room, its surface neat except for a few documents and a silver-framed photograph of a younger Jack with an older couple Florence assumed were his parents. "Please sit," Jack invited, indicating a comfortable chair. "The judge should arrive shortly." Florence perched on the edge of the chair, tension making it impossible to relax. "What exactly will happen today? Judge Foster will take your sworn statement," Jack explained. "If he finds it credible, and I've no doubt he can issue warrants for the men involved in the attack." "Including Barton?" Jack hesitated. "That's where things get complicated. Your testimony links his men to the crime, but not Barton himself. We need more." "Evan Cole," Florence said, understanding. "We need him to confirm Barton gave the orders." "Yes," Jack agreed. "And Lucia believes she knows how to reach him." As if on cue, the office door opened to admit Lucia and an older man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes. Judge Henry Foster carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, his gaze assessing Florence with keen interest. "Miss Taylor," he greeted her. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Mr. Aldridge has told me something of your ordeal." Florence rose to shake his offered hand. "Thank you for agreeing to hear my testimony, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "All business now. Let's proceed then. I'll need you to recount the events exactly as they occurred, with as much detail as you can recall." For the next hour, Florence relived the attack on her homestead, the sudden gunfire, her father's death, the destruction of their home, and the raiders' return the following day. Judge Foster listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. When she finished, he asked several pointed questions about the men she'd seen and what they had said about Barton. Florence answered as precisely as possible, conscious of the legal weight her words carried. "You've endured a terrible injustice, Miss Taylor," Judge Foster said finally. "Based on your testimony, I can issue warrants for the men you saw once they're properly identified." He glanced at Jack. "But as for Barton himself—" "We understand, Your Honor," Jack interjected. "We're working on securing additional testimony that will directly implicate him." The judge's expression was skeptical. "Barton's men are unlikely to turn against him. He pays well for loyalty." "Everyone has a price," Lucia observed quietly, "or a weakness. Evan Cole has both." Judge Foster considered this. "I'll remain in Agua Caliente for 3 days. If you can bring me corroborating testimony by then, I'll act on it." He rose, gathering his papers. "But be careful. If Barton suspects what you're doing, he won't hesitate to eliminate the threat." After the judge departed, Florence slumped back in her chair, emotionally drained from reliving her father's murder. 3 days isn't much time." "It's enough," Lucia said confidently. "I've arranged to meet Evan Cole tonight. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to become our key witness." "How?" Florence asked. Lucia exchanged glances with Jack before answering. "Evan has a sister in Tucson. She's ill consumption, and her treatment costs more than he can afford on an honest wage. That's why he went to work for Barton. So we offer him money," Florence guessed. "Among other things," Jack confirmed. "Money, protection, and a chance to clear his conscience. Men like Evan, they don't start out bad. Circumstances push them into bad choices." Florence wasn't sure she could be so charitable toward one of the men who had participated in destroying her life, but she understood the strategy. "What's my role in this?" "For now, nothing," Jack said firmly. "It's safer if you stay here while Lucia makes the initial contact." Florence bristled at being sidelined. "It's my father who was murdered, my home that was burned. I should be part of this." "And you will be," Jack assured her, moving to sit beside her. "But not tonight. Evan knows Lucia from town. He won't be immediately suspicious of her. You, on the other hand, he might recognize me from the homestead," Florence conceded reluctantly. "Exactly. Once Lucia has explained our offer, then you can meet him." Jack's expression softened. "I know waiting is difficult. But we need to be strategic." Florence wanted to argue further but knew he was right. "Fine," she agreed, "but I want to know everything as soon as you return." Jack's smile was warm enough to chase away some of her frustration. "I promise. Now let's get you back to the boarding house. You should rest while you can." Outside, the gathering clouds had darkened, promising imminent rain. The air felt heavy with moisture unusual for the typically dry Arizona climate. Florence welcomed the change. The cooler temperature was a relief after days of relentless heat. They were halfway to the boarding house when a commotion near the saloon caught their attention. A group of men had emerged onto the boardwalk, their loud voices carrying clearly in the still air. "That's Barton," Jack murmured, drawing Florence into the shadow of a nearby storefront. "And the man with the red bandana, he's the one you identified as the leader of the raiders." Florence felt her blood run cold as she studied the men across the street. Victor Barton was older than she'd imagined, perhaps in his late 50s, with iron-gray hair and an imposing build that spoke of a life of physical activity despite his obvious wealth. His companion, the man with the red bandana now hanging loosely around his neck, was younger and leaner, with a gunfighter's stance and cold eyes that scanned the street constantly. "His name is Reese Dalton," Jack supplied. "Barton's foreman and enforcer. The others are part of his crew." Florence searched the group, looking for a younger man who might be Evan Cole. She spotted him standing slightly apart from the others, barely more than a boy, really, with sandy hair and an uncomfortable expression as Barton laughed at some crude joke. "Is that Evan?" she whispered. "The one looking like he wishes he were elsewhere," Jack nodded. "That's him. And this is fortunate timing now we know they're in town. Lucia can approach him once Barton and the others move on." As if summoned by their discussion, Lucia appeared from a side street, pausing when she spotted them in the shadows. With a barely perceptible nod, she acknowledged the situation and continued on her way, seemingly absorbed in adjusting her shawl against the threatening rain. Barton and his men eventually returned to the saloon, all except Evan, who headed in the direction of the livery stable. Lucia followed at a discreet distance, her movements casual enough not to attract attention. "She'll make contact and arrange the meeting," Jack said. "Let's get you back to the boarding house before this storm breaks." They had just reached the boarding house porch when the first heavy drops began to fall. Within moments, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning Agua Caliente's dusty streets to mud and sending people scurrying for shelter. "You should stay until it passes," Florence suggested, gesturing to the parlor. "Mrs. Mathers always keeps coffee hot on days like this." Jack hesitated, glancing at the deluge. "I should check with Lucia." "She'll find you when she's ready," Florence pointed out. "And you'll catch your death if you go back out in that." A crash of thunder punctuated her words, as if nature itself agreed with her assessment. Jack laughed, conceding defeat. "All right, coffee would be welcome." They settled in the parlor, which they had to themselves due to the early hour. Mrs. Mathers brought coffee and freshly baked biscuits, her knowing smile suggesting she approved of Florence's company. "The storm's supposed to last all day," she informed them. "Flash flood warnings up at Rattlesnake Creek." She gave Florence a sympathetic pat. "Good thing you weren't out at your place, dear. That creek rises something fierce during summer rains." After she bustled away, Jack and Florence sat in comfortable silence, watching the rain through the parlor windows. Florence found herself studying Jack's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw and the thoughtful set of his mouth. He was handsome, certainly, but it was more than that. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that drew her in despite her best intentions. "Tell me more about your plans," she said, breaking the silence. "For the railway, I mean." Jack turned from the window, his expression brightening with enthusiasm. "The southern route through Arizona is crucial for connecting California to the rest of the country. Agua Caliente is perfectly positioned as a waypoint. We have water, relatively flat terrain for miles in either direction, and a community ready for economic development." "And Barton wants the railway to go through his land instead," Florence guessed. "He wants control," Jack clarified. "If the railway crosses his property, he can dictate terms to the company, charge for water rights, demand a percentage of shipping fees, essentially create a bottleneck that funnels money into his pockets. At the expense of the entire territory's development," Florence realized. "Exactly," Jack confirmed. "It's never been about legitimate business for Barton, it's about power." Florence considered this. And my father's land, a key piece in the puzzle, Jack explained. Your property includes one of the few viable crossings on Rattlesnake Creek. Without it, the railway would have to detour miles south through Barton's ranch. So my father died because his land was in the way of Barton's scheme, Florence said bitterly. Just another obstacle to be removed. Jack reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Your father died because Barton is a ruthless man who believes his wealth puts him above the law. But he's wrong, and we're going to prove it. The warmth of his touch sent a flutter through Florence's chest that had nothing to do with grief or anger. She found herself acutely aware of his closeness, of the earnest intensity in his blue eyes, of the strength in his hand covering hers. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither had yet acknowledged. Then, as if suddenly conscious of the impropriety, Jack withdrew his hand, clearing his throat. The rain seems to be easing, he observed, though the downpour outside showed no signs of abating. I should check on Lucia's progress. Florence nodded, oddly disappointed. Of course. Jack rose, hesitating at the parlor door. I'll return this evening to let you know what's been arranged with Evan Cole. His expression softened. Try to rest, Florence. Tomorrow may be challenging. After he left, Florence remained in the parlor, watching the rain and replaying their conversation in her mind. She had no business feeling this way about Jack Aldridge, not now, with her father barely cold in his grave and her future so uncertain. Yet the warmth his presence kindled refused to be dismissed as mere gratitude. This is madness, she murmured to herself. The man is helping you because it serves his own interests against Barton, but even as she thought it, Florence knew it wasn't entirely true. There was more between them than shared purpose, a connection that had begun the moment he found her collapsed in the desert and continued to grow despite the circumstances. The day passed slowly, the rain eventually giving way to a damp, heavy stillness as evening approached. Florence helped Mrs. Mathers prepare dinner for the boarding house guests, grateful for the distraction of simple tasks. She was setting the dining room table when Jack returned, his clothes damp from the lingering drizzle. One look at his face told Florence that something had changed. What's happened? She asked, setting down the plates she'd been arranging. Lucia made contact with Evan, Jack replied, keeping his voice low. He's willing to meet, but there's a complication. Barton's pulling out tomorrow, heading back to his ranch with all his men. If we're going to get Evan's testimony, it has to be tonight, Florence's pulse quickened. Did he agree to testify? Not yet, Jack admitted. He's scared, and with good reason. Barton doesn't forgive betrayal, but he's willing to hear our offer. When and where? Midnight at the abandoned miller's house on the edge of town, Jack said. Lucia will bring him. I'll collect you at 11:30, Florence nodded, anticipation and anxiety mingling in her stomach. I'll be ready. Jack's gaze lingered on her face, concern evident in his eyes. This will be dangerous, Florence, if Barton discovers what we're doing. I know the risks, she interrupted, and I accept them. My father deserves justice, no matter the cost. Jack seemed about to say more, but Mrs. Mathers appeared from the kitchen, effectively ending their private conversation. Mr. Aldridge, will you be joining us for dinner? I've made chicken and dumplings. Thank you, Mrs. Mathers, but I have business to attend to, Jack declined politely. I'll return later to speak with Miss Taylor about a matter concerning her father's estate. The landlady nodded knowingly. Of course, of course. Such a tragedy, losing Mr. Taylor that way. Thank goodness Florence has friends to help her through this difficult time. She patted Florence's arm affectionately before returning to the kitchen. 11:30, Jack confirmed quietly. Be careful what you say to anyone, even Mrs. Mathers. Barton has ears everywhere. After he departed, Florence found herself too nervous to eat much dinner despite Mrs. Mathers' excellent cooking. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching like molasses as she waited in her room, the small revolver Jack had given her hidden in the folds of her skirt. When a soft knock finally came at her door, Florence was ready, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the night chill. Jack stood in the hallway, dressed in dark clothing with his gun belt visible beneath his open coat. Ready? He asked, his expression grave. Florence nodded, closing her door quietly behind her. They descended the stairs and slipped out the back entrance of the boarding house, avoiding the main street where late-night revelers might notice their passage. The abandoned miller's house stood on the western edge of town, its weathered structure barely visible in the moonlight that occasionally broke through scattering clouds. Jack approached cautiously, one hand on his revolver, the other guiding Florence along the overgrown path. A lantern glowed dimly inside, its light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. Jack tapped lightly on the door, 3 quick knocks followed by 2 slower ones, and it opened to reveal Lucia's concerned face. "Quickly," she urged, ushering them inside. "Evan is nervous enough already." The interior of the old house was dusty and bare except for a rickety table where the lantern stood and a few crates serving as makeshift seats. Evan Cole paced near the back wall, his young face taut with anxiety. He froze when Florence entered, recognition widening his eyes. "You're the woman from the homestead," he said hoarsely. "You survived." Florence met his gaze steadily. "Yes, no thanks to you and your friends." Evan flinched as if she had struck him. "I never fired a shot," he protested weakly. "I didn't know they were going to kill anyone." "Barton said we were just going to scare them off the land. Yet you went back the next day to search for the deed," Florence countered, anger sharpening her words. "After seeing what they did to my father." Shame colored Evan's face. "I had no choice." "My sister, we know about your sister," Jack interrupted, his tone gentler than Florence's. "That's why we're here, Evan. We want to offer you a way out." The young man's expression shifted from shame to cautious hope. "What kind of way out?" "Testimony," Jack said simply. "Tell Judge Foster what happened, how Barton ordered the raid, what instructions he gave, everything you know about his land-grabbing operations." "In exchange for what?" Evan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Money for your sister's treatment," Jack replied. "Enough to get her to a sanatorium in Colorado where they're having success with new methods. Plus protection for both of you, new identities, a fresh start somewhere Barton can't find you." Evan laughed bitterly. "Barton finds everyone eventually. You don't know what he's capable of." "I know exactly what he's capable of," Florence said coldly. "I watched my father die because of his greed." Her words hung in the air between them, stark and uncompromising. Evan looked away first, his shoulders slumping. "If I do this," he said finally, "I need guarantees. Written promises about the money and protection, and I need to know my sister will be taken care of if something happens to me." Jack nodded. "I've prepared documents to that effect. Judge Foster will witness them tomorrow." He removed a folded paper from his coat. "This is my personal guarantee in the meantime." Evan took the paper, reading it by the lantern light. "This says you'll advance funds for my sister's care immediately before I testify." "As a show of good faith," Jack confirmed. "Lucia will accompany you to Tucson tomorrow to make the arrangements while I secure your testimony with Judge Foster." The young man studied Jack's face, searching for deception. Finding none, he folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt. "All right, I'll do it." Relief washed over Florence, followed immediately by wariness. This seemed too easy. "Tell me what happened," she demanded. "I want to hear it from you before we go to the judge." Evan sighed, sinking onto one of the crates. "Barton's been buying up land along the proposed railway route for months. Most folks sold willingly. He offered fair prices at first, but some held out, including your father. So he decided to take it by force," Florence concluded. Evan nodded. "He told Reese to persuade the holdouts. Usually that meant threats, maybe some property damage, but your father..." He hesitated. "What about my father?" Florence pressed. "He fought back," Evan said quietly. "When we rode up, he was ready for trouble, fired a warning shot. Reese took it personally. He's always been quick-tempered." "Things escalated," Florence repeated incredulously. "My father was murdered. Our home was burned to the ground. That's not escalation, that's cold-blooded crime." "I know," Evan admitted, his voice breaking. "I know what we did was wrong. That's why I'm here." Lucia, who had been silently monitoring the exchange, suddenly moved to the window. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently. "Multiple riders." Jack extinguished the lantern with one quick movement. "Out the back," he ordered. Now. They moved swiftly through the darkened house, but before they reached the rear door, the sound of splintering would announce that the front entrance had been breached. "Well, well," a cold voice drawled. "What have we here? A midnight meeting of the Territorial Improvement Committee." Lantern light flared, revealing Victor Barton standing in the doorway, flanked by Reese Dalton and two other men. All were armed. Jack pushed Florence behind him, his hand moving to his revolver. "This is private property, Barton. You're trespassing?" Barton laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "That's rich, coming from you, Aldridge. Trespassing is the least of the charges I could level right now." His cold eyes fixed on Evan. "Especially considering the company you're keeping." Evan had gone deathly pale, his earlier resolve evaporating under Barton's piercing gaze. "Mr. Barton, I can explain." "Save it," Barton snapped. "Your presence here tells me everything I need to know." He signaled to Reese, who moved forward, his gun trained on Evan's chest. "Bring him." "Wait," Jack interjected, his own weapon now drawn. "You're outnumbered, Barton." 4 against 4, not odds I'd take if I were you." Barton's smile was predatory. "Count again, Aldridge." The rear door crashed open, admitting 2 more of Barton's men. One immediately grabbed Lucia, pressing a revolver to her temple. The other circled around to cover Jack from behind. "Now," Barton continued smoothly, "I suggest everyone lower their weapons before this gets unnecessarily messy." Florence felt cold fear settling in her stomach as Jack reluctantly lowered his gun. They were trapped, outmaneuvered by a man who had already proven his willingness to kill. "What do you want, Barton?" Jack demanded, his voice steady despite the dire situation. "Originally, just to find out who was meeting my man in the middle of the night." Barton's gaze shifted to Florence. "But now I see we have the Taylor girl as well. This is turning into quite the fortuitous evening." "You won't get away with another murder," Florence declared, stepping out from behind Jack despite his attempt to keep her sheltered. "People know what you did to my father." Barton raised an eyebrow. "Do they?" "All I see is a tragic situation, a young woman distraught over her father's accidental death, spreading vicious rumors, and now, apparently, attempting to bribe one of my employees." He sighed dramatically. "It's understandable, of course. Grief can make people irrational." "We have evidence," Florence insisted. "The deed to our land, testimony about your plans for the railway route, circumstantial at best," Barton dismissed, "and rather difficult to present from a grave." He gestured to his men. "Bind them. We'll take them somewhere more private to continue this discussion." As one of Barton's men moved toward her with a length of rope, Florence's hand found the small revolver hidden in her skirt. In one fluid motion, she drew the weapon and fired. The shot went wide, splintering wood near Barton's head. The momentary distraction was enough for Jack to lunge for his discarded gun. Chaos erupted as more shots were fired in the confined space. Florence dropped to the floor, crawling toward the overturned table for cover. Through the smoke and confusion, she saw Jack grappling with Reese, their struggle carrying them against the far wall. Lucia had broken free of her captor and was fighting for control of his weapon. Evan had disappeared in the commotion, either fled or fallen. Florence couldn't tell. A hand grabbed her ankle, dragging her from her tenuous shelter. Florence kicked out desperately, connecting with something solid. A grunt of pain rewarded her efforts, and the grip loosened momentarily. She scrambled to her feet, searching frantically for Jack in the melee. She spotted him near the door, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead but still fighting. "Florence," he shouted. "Run." Instead, she fired again, this time with better aim. The man advancing on Jack cried out, clutching his shoulder as he stumbled backward. Jack seized the opportunity, lunging forward to deliver a knockout blow. "Lucia," he called. "The back door." Florence saw Lucia break free from her opponent and dash toward the rear of the house. She followed, Jack close behind. They emerged into the cool night air, sprinting away from the abandoned mill house toward the cover of nearby trees. Behind them, Barton's angry voice ordered pursuit. Gunshots rang out, bullets thudding into tree trunks as they ran. "This way," Jack gasped, guiding them deeper into the wooded area. "There's a ravine ahead, we can lose them there." They stumbled through the darkness, branches whipping at their faces, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and their attackers. Finally, they reached the ravine Jack had mentioned, a steep-sided gully carved by seasonal floodwaters. "Down here," he directed, helping first Lucia then Florence navigate the slippery slope. At the bottom, a trickle of water remained from the recent rains, but the ravine itself offered good cover. "Where's Evan?" Lucia asked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I don't know," Jack admitted. "He might have gotten away in the confusion, or Barton has him," Florence added grimly. She leaned against the earthen wall, suddenly aware of a burning sensation in her arm. Looking down, she was surprised to see blood soaking through her sleeve. "You're hurt," Jack said, moving quickly to her side. "It's just a graze," Florence assured him, though the pain was becoming more noticeable now that the immediate danger had passed. "What do we do now?" Jack tore a strip from his shirt, binding the wound with gentle efficiency. "We need to get to Judge Foster. With or without Evan's testimony, we have enough to convince him to act. Barton will be looking for us," Lucia pointed out. "He'll have men watching the judge's hotel." "Then we go somewhere else," Jack decided. "Somewhere Barton wouldn't think to look." He finished securing Florence's bandage. "Can you make it to the church? Father Ignacio will help us." Florence nodded, determination overriding the pain in her arm. "I can make it." They moved carefully along the ravine until they found a place to climb out, then made their way through back alleys toward Agua Caliente's small adobe church. The town was quiet, most residents long since retired for the night. Those still awake were concentrated around the saloon, far from their current position. Father Ignacio, a slight man with silver-streaked black hair, answered their knock immediately, as if he had been expecting them. His dark eyes took in their disheveled appearance and Florence's bandaged arm without comment. "Come," he said simply, ushering them inside and locking the door behind them. "The rectory will be safer than the church proper." He led them to a small room adjacent to the sanctuary, sparsely furnished but clean. A crucifix hung on one wall, a narrow bed and writing desk occupying most of the available space. "Sit," the priest instructed, gesturing to the bed and the room's only chair. "I will bring water and bandages for proper treatment of that wound." After he left, Jack sagged against the wall, the adrenaline that had carried him through their escape visibly ebbing. Blood still seeped from the cut on his forehead, and Florence noticed he was favoring his left leg. "You're injured too," she observed, concern sharpening her voice. Jack attempted a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nothing serious. Reese got in a few good hits, that's all." "We need to get word to Judge Foster," Lucia reminded them. "If Barton realizes we're gathering evidence against him, he might flee the territory." "Father Ignacio can help with that," Jack said. "He has connections throughout the community people Barton wouldn't suspect." The priest returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and a small medical kit. He worked silently, cleaning and rebandaging Florence's arm before attending to Jack's injuries. "You are in trouble," he observed as he stitched the cut on Jack's forehead. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Father," Jack admitted. "We need to reach Judge Foster without Victor Barton's knowledge." Father Ignacio nodded as if this request was perfectly reasonable. "The judge attends early mass. I will speak with him then." He secured the last stitch with practiced fingers. "You should rest now. The rectory is secure and I sleep lightly." After the priest withdrew, Lucia claimed the chair while Jack insisted Florence take the narrow bed. He positioned himself near the door, his revolver within easy reach. "Try to sleep," he advised. "Tomorrow will require clear heads." Despite her exhaustion, Florence found sleep elusive. The events of the night played repeatedly in her mind: the confrontation with Barton, the chaotic escape, the uncertainty of Evan's fate. And beneath it all, the constant awareness of Jack's presence, his unwavering support despite the danger to himself. "Jack," she whispered, knowing he was still awake, "why did you really help me? The truth." In the dim light filtering through the small window, she saw him turn toward her, his expression thoughtful. "At first, it was because I saw an opportunity to finally bring Barton to justice," he admitted. "Your situation provided the evidence I'd been seeking for months." And now, Florence pressed, Jack was silent for a long moment. Now it's because I can't imagine doing anything else. His voice softened. You faced unimaginable loss with more courage than most men I know, Florence. You deserve justice, yes, but also a chance at the future your father wanted for you. The sincerity in his words touched something deep within Florence, a place beyond grief and anger where hope still flickered. I'm afraid, she confessed, not of Barton, but of what happens after. I don't know how to start again with nothing. You don't have nothing, Jack countered gently. You have your land, your father's dreams, and, he hesitated, and people who care what happens to you. The unspoken sentiment hung in the air between them, too new and fragile to be named but impossible to ignore. Florence felt her heart beating faster, aware that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Before she could respond, Lucia stirred in the chair. If you two are going to talk all night, I'll never get any sleep, she grumbled, though there was no real irritation in her tone. Jack cleared his throat, the moment broken. Sorry, Lucia, get some rest, both of you. Morning will be here soon enough. Florence closed her eyes, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, despite the gravity of their situation. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something besides grief and anger, a warmth that promised healing might eventually be possible. She was drifting towards sleep when a soft knock at the door brought them all instantly alert. Jack rose silently, revolver ready, as Father Ignacio entered. Evan Cole is at the back entrance, the priest informed them quietly. He is injured but conscious. Jack and Lucia exchanged surprised glances. Bring him in, Jack decided after a moment's consideration. Evan looked worse than injured. His face was bruised and bloody, one eye swollen shut, and he cradled his left arm, which hung at an unnatural angle. He stumbled into the room, collapsing onto the chair Lucia vacated. They caught me, he rasped, accepting the water Father Ignacio offered. Reese worked me over pretty good before I managed to get away. Why come here? Jack asked, suspicion evident in his tone. How did you know where to find us? I didn't, Evan admitted. I came to confess to Father Ignacio, found you instead. A bitter smile twisted his battered face. Maybe that's Providence. Florence studied him carefully, noting the sincerity in his remaining good eye. You still want to testify against Barton? Evan nodded painfully. More than ever. What he ordered Reese to do to me, he shuddered. I was loyal, and this is how he repays it. Barton doesn't deserve loyalty from anyone. He'll be looking for you, Jack pointed out. For all of us, I know. That's why we need to move quickly. Evan grimaced as he shifted position. Barton's planning to leave at first light, heading back to his ranch with all his men. He thinks you'll go to ground, wait for things to cool off. Jack considered this information, so he doesn't know about Judge Foster. If he does, he didn't mention it, Evan replied, but Barton's smart, he'll have contingencies. Father Ignacio, who had been listening silently, spoke up. The judge will be here for early mass in 3 hours. I suggest you all rest until then. I will tend to Mr. Cole's injuries. With the priest's help, they rearranged the small room to accommodate everyone. Florence insisted on giving up the bed to Evan, whose injuries were clearly the most severe. She settled on the floor beside Jack, a blanket the only barrier between them and the hard, packed earth. Despite the discomfort and the tension of their situation, Florence eventually drifted into fitful sleep, her dreams a confused jumble of burning buildings, gunfire, and Jack's steady presence beside her. She woke to Father Ignacio's gentle touch on her shoulder. The judge is here, he whispered. In the sanctuary. The gray light of dawn filtered through the small window as they rose, stiff and sore from their uncomfortable rest. Evan looked marginally better, his arm now properly splinted and his wounds cleaned. Jack helped him to his feet, supporting him as they made their way to the church proper. Judge Foster waited at the altar, his expression grave as he took in their battered appearance. Father Ignacio has informed me of the situation, he said without preamble. I'm prepared to take Mr. Cole's testimony immediately and issue warrants for Barton and his men. Evan stepped forward, his good eye resolute despite the pain evident in his face. I'm ready, Your Honor. I'll tell you everything. For the next hour, Evan detailed Barton's systematic campaign to acquire land along the railway route, including the orders to intimidate or eliminate holdouts like Florence's father. He described the attack on the Taylor homestead, Reese Dalton's quick trigger finger, and Barton's subsequent orders to find and destroy the land deed. He was explicit, Evan concluded. He said no deed, no claim, and no witnesses. He knew exactly what had happened to Mr. Taylor and approved it after the fact. Judge Foster's expression remained impassive as he recorded Evan's testimony, but the tightness around his mouth betrayed his disgust. When Evan finished, the judge reviewed his notes briefly before looking up. This is sufficient evidence to issue warrants for the arrest of Victor Barton and his associates on charges of murder, arson, conspiracy, and numerous other crimes. He closed his notebook with finality. I'll dispatch federal marshals immediately. Barton's leaving town this morning, Jack reminded him. If we wait for marshals, he'll be gone. The judge frowned. What do you suggest, Mr. Aldridge, that I deputize you to arrest one of the most powerful men in the territory? If necessary, yes, Jack replied without hesitation. We can't let him escape justice again. Judge Foster studied Jack thoughtfully, then shifted his gaze to Florence, Lucia, and Evan. This isn't just about the law for any of you, is it? It's personal. He killed my father, Florence said simply, destroyed everything we had built. Yes, it's personal, the judge sighed, seeming to age before their eyes. I've spent 30 years upholding the law, often at the expense of justice. Perhaps it's time to restore the balance. He reached into his coat and withdrew several folded documents. These are the warrants. As of this moment, I am deputizing Mr. Aldridge to execute them. Jack accepted the papers with a solemn nod. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, Foster cautioned. Barton won't go quietly and his men are loyal. This could get very ugly very quickly. Then we need a plan, Jack said, turning to the others. Something Barton won't expect. They huddled together in the sanctuary, voices low as they formulated a strategy. Outside, Agua Caliente was coming to life, the sounds of the awakening town filtering through the church windows. Barton will expect us to confront him directly, Jack reasoned. But that plays to his strengths. We need to separate him from his men. The railway office, Lucia suggested. He has a meeting scheduled there this morning before he leaves town, something about finalizing the southern route. He'll bring Reese, but the others will be preparing for departure. How do you know that? Florence asked. Lucia smiled faintly. The newspaper office is across from the railway office. I overhear things. So we intercept him there, Jack decided. Judge Foster can have Sheriff Daniels and his deputy present allegedly for security, but actually to execute the warrants. Daniels won't cooperate, Evan objected. He's in Barton's pocket. He'll cooperate with a federal judge, Foster assured them. Whatever his personal loyalties, Daniels isn't foolish enough to defy federal authority openly. They refined the plan, assigning roles and considering contingencies. Florence insisted on being present, despite Jack's concerns for her safety. This is my fight too, she reminded him. Perhaps more than anyone's. Finally, with the plan settled, they prepared to move. Judge Foster would approach Sheriff Daniels, ensuring his cooperation or at least his neutrality. Lucia would return to the newspaper office, positioning herself to observe the railway office across the street. Jack and Florence would confront Barton directly, with the judge and sheriff arriving moments later to serve the warrants. Evan, still too injured to participate actively, would remain hidden at the church. Be careful, he warned as they prepared to leave. Barton is dangerous even when cornered, especially when cornered. Outside, the day was bright and clear, the previous day's rain having washed the dust from the air. Florence walked beside Jack, acutely aware that the next few hours would determine not just Barton's fate, but her own as well. Are you certain about this? Jack asked softly as they approached the main street. No one would blame you for staying out of harm's way. Florence met his concerned gaze steadily. I'm certain. My father deserves to see justice done, even if only through me. Jack's expression softened. You're remarkable, Florence Taylor. I hope you know that. Before she could respond, they reached the turn onto Main Street, and separated according to plan, Jack continuing toward the railway office while Florence entered the general store across the street, positioning herself near the window to observe Barton's arrival. The wait was excruciating. Minutes stretched into a half hour, then an hour. Florence's nerves were stretched to breaking point when she finally spotted Barton and Reese approaching the railway office. They moved with the confidence of men accustomed to deference, nodding to townspeople who hastily made way for them. As they reached the office door, Jack emerged from the shadows of the building next door. Even from across the street, Florence could see the determination in his stance as he called out to Barton. She couldn't hear the exchange, but she saw Barton's expression shift from surprise to cold anger. Reese's hand moved to his gun belt, but Jack already had the warrants extended before him, a shield of legality against violence. This was her cue. Florence left the general store, crossing the street with deliberate steps. Barton spotted her approach, his eyes narrowing dangerously. She halted beside Jack, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Victor Barton," she said clearly, ensuring her words carried to the gathering crowd of onlookers. "You ordered the murder of my father, Henry Taylor. You sent men to burn our home and steal our land." Barton's face reddened with fury. "You have no proof of these ridiculous accusations, Miss Taylor, and you, Aldridge, these so-called warrants are meaningless. Judge Whitley will dismiss them before sundown." "These warrants were issued by Federal Judge Henry Foster," Jack corrected, his tone deceptively mild. "And they're based on sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, including one of your own men." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Barton's eyes. "What man?" "Who would dare? That's no longer your concern," Judge Foster's authoritative voice announced as he approached, flanked by Sheriff Daniels and his deputy. "Victor Barton, you are under arrest for the murder of Henry Taylor, conspiracy to commit land fraud, and numerous other crimes against the people of Arizona Territory." Sheriff Daniels stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to defy a federal judge in public. "Mr. Barton, I need to ask for your weapon." Reese tensed, his hand still hovering near his gun. "Boss," the moment balanced on a knife's edge, violence imminent in the rigid set of Barton's shoulders and the dangerous gleam in Reese's eyes. Florence held her breath, acutely aware that this confrontation could still end in bloodshed. Then, with deliberate slowness, Barton raised his hands. "This isn't over, Aldridge," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not by a long shot." "For now it is," Jack replied evenly. "Sheriff, please disarm Mr. Dalton as well." The tension dissipated incrementally as Daniels and his deputy secured the prisoners. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, surprise, speculation, and the first whispers of justice long overdue. Judge Foster stepped forward. "I'll require statements from all witnesses. Sheriff, secure the prisoners in your jail. I'm establishing a federal court session tomorrow morning to begin preliminary hearings." As the prisoners were led away, Florence felt a curious lightness replace the tension that had sustained her through the confrontation. Justice wouldn't bring her father back, but it provided a foundation upon which she could begin to rebuild her life. Jack's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "It's not completely over," he cautioned. "There will be a trial, testimony." "I know," Florence acknowledged, "but it's a beginning." They stood together in the dusty street, watched by curious townspeople who sensed that something significant had shifted in Agua Caliente. The day stretched before them, filled with statements to be given and arrangements to be made for Evan's sister and his own protection. But in that moment, with Jack's hand warm around hers and Barton's power broken, Florence allowed herself to feel something she had thought lost forever in the flames of her homestead hope. The following weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, testimony, and gradual healing. Judge Foster established a temporary federal court in Agua Caliente, hearing evidence not just about Henry Taylor's murder, but dozens of other crimes attributed to Barton and his men. Florence testified twice, first about the attack on their homestead, then about the confrontation at the abandoned miller's house. Each time, she faced Barton across the courtroom, his cold eyes promising retribution. Each time, Jack sat behind her, his steady presence a reminder that she no longer faced her battles alone. Evan Cole's testimony proved crucial, providing the direct link between Barton and the murder. As promised, Jack arranged treatment for Evan's sister at a sanatorium in Colorado, along with new identities for both of them once the trial concluded. By early September, the verdict was rendered. Victor Barton and Reese Dalton were found guilty of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced them to hang, though Florence took no satisfaction from this ultimate punishment. No execution could restore what she had lost. The other men involved received lesser sentences based on their level of participation and willingness to testify. Florence found it surprisingly easy to forgive Evan, whose remorse seemed genuine and whose courage in testifying had helped secure justice. As autumn approached, Florence faced a decision about her future. The railway company had offered to purchase her land at a fair price, far more than her father had paid, enough to establish herself comfortably anywhere she chose. "You could go east," Jack suggested one evening as they walked along Agua Caliente's quiet main street. St. Louis, Chicago cities with opportunities for a woman of your intelligence and determination. Florence considered this. "I could," she agreed, "but that would mean leaving everything my father worked for, everything we dreamed of building together." Jack stopped walking, turning to face her. The setting sun painted his features in gold and shadow, highlighting the seriousness in his blue eyes. "What did you dream of, Florence? Not just your father's dreams, but yours?" The question caught her off guard. For so long, she had defined her aspirations in relation to her father's, supporting his ventures, helping manifest his vision. She had rarely considered what she might want independently. "I dreamed of a home," she said slowly, the truth revealing itself as she spoke. "Not just a house, but a place of belonging, somewhere to put down roots that couldn't be easily torn away." "And now," Jack prompted gently, "what do you dream of now?" Florence looked up at him, suddenly aware of how much had changed since that terrible day when he'd found her collapsed in the desert. The grief remained, a part of her that would never completely heal, but it no longer defined her entire existence. "I dream of building something lasting," she admitted, "something my father would be proud of, and—" She hesitated, gathering courage, "and I dream of not doing it alone." Jack's expression softened, hope kindling in his eyes. "Florence, Mr. Aldridge, Miss Taylor." Lucia's voice interrupted as she hurried toward them, waving a telegram. "The governor has upheld the sentences. Its official justice has been served." Jack accepted the telegram, reading it quickly before passing it to Florence. "Thank you, Lucia. This brings closure to many in the territory." Lucia nodded, her sharp eyes noting the interrupted moment between them. "I should return to the office. We'll run the story in tomorrow's edition." She departed with a knowing smile, leaving them to resume their conversation. But the moment had passed, the vulnerability of Florence's admission covered by the practical matter of Barton's fate. They walked on in companionable silence, each lost in thought. It was only when they reached the boarding house that Jack spoke again. "I'm leaving for San Francisco tomorrow," he said abruptly. "Railway business that can't be postponed any longer." Florence felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "I see. How long will you be gone?" "A week, perhaps 2. Jack hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Florence, when I return, there's something important I'd like to discuss with you." "What is it?" she asked, her heart beating faster despite her attempt at composure. Jack smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "Something about dreams and not pursuing them alone." He lifted her fingers to his lips, the gesture both courtly and intimate. "Until I return," Florence watched him walk away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the gathering dusk. A curious mixture of anticipation and anxiety fluttered in her chest as she considered what his words might mean. The next 2 weeks passed with excruciating slowness. Florence occupied herself with practical matters, visiting her father's grave, consulting with the railway company about the potential sale of her land, and helping Mrs. Mathers at the boarding house to earn her keep. Lucia became a constant companion, her forthright manner and sharp intelligence providing welcome distraction from thoughts of Jack. Through her, Florence learned more about Agua Caliente and its people, their histories, aspirations, and the complex web of relationships that define the small community. "You've become something of a local hero," Lucia informed her one afternoon as they sorted type in the newspaper office. Standing up to Barton, seeing justice done, people admire that, Florence shook her head. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Lucia contradicted firmly. "Most people would have accepted their loss and moved on, especially a woman alone. You chose to fight back." She arranged a line of type with practiced efficiency. "That's why Jack admires you so much." Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Has he said something to you?" Lucia laughed. "He doesn't need to. I have eyes." Her expression softened with genuine affection. "He's a good man, Florence." "The best I know." "Yes," Florence agreed quietly. "He is." The afternoon Jack was due to return, Florence found herself uncharacteristically concerned with her appearance. She wore her best dress, a deep blue calico purchased with some of the railway company's advance payment, and arranged her hair with extra care. Mrs. Mathers noticed her preparations with maternal approval. "You look lovely, dear. Mr. Aldridge will be most impressed." Florence started to deny any such intention, then stopped herself. What was the point in pretending? These past weeks had clarified her feelings beyond doubt. Jack Aldridge had become essential to her happiness in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was helping Mrs. Mathers prepare dinner when the landlady glanced out the window and smiled. "Speaking of the devil, here comes Mr. Aldridge now." Florence's heart leapt as she moved to the window. Sure enough, Jack was approaching the boarding house, his stride purposeful. He looked tired from travel, but somehow more determined than when he'd left. "I'll just make myself scarce," Mrs. Mathers announced with transparent subtlety. "Those biscuits need checking." Jack knocked just as the landlady disappeared into the kitchen. Florence opened the door, suddenly shy despite their weeks of shared danger and purpose. "Welcome back," she greeted him, stepping aside to allow him entry. "How was your journey?" "Productive," Jack replied, his eyes warm as they took in her appearance, "though longer than I would have liked." He glanced toward the parlor. "Might we speak privately?" Florence nodded, leading the way to the familiar room where they had shared coffee during the rainstorm that now seemed a lifetime ago. Jack waited until she was seated before taking the chair opposite her, his expression serious but tinged with something she hadn't seen before: nervousness. "Florence," he began, then paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "These past weeks have given me time to think about many things, about the railway, about Agua Caliente's future, about my own plans." "And have you reached any conclusions?" Florence asked, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Jack leaned forward, his gaze direct. "Yes. The most important being that none of those plans hold meaning without you in them." Florence's breath caught as Jack rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "I know we've known each other only a short time and under extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps this is too soon, too presumptuous." He drew a deep breath. "But I love you, Florence Taylor. I think I have since the moment you opened your eyes in the desert and showed more concern for propriety than your own survival." A laugh bubbled up through the tears that had begun to form in Florence's eyes. "That was rather foolish of me, wasn't it?" "Endearing," Jack corrected, smiling. "Like your courage, your determination, your loyalty to your father's memory." His expression grew solemn again. "I'm asking if you might consider building that lasting dream you spoke of with me, not as a replacement for what you've lost, but as a new beginning." Florence looked into his earnest blue eyes, seeing the future she had begun to imagine during his absence, a life of purpose and companionship, of shared dreams and mutual support. "Are you proposing marriage, Mr. Aldridge?" she asked, needing the clarity of direct words. "I am, Miss Taylor," Jack confirmed, a hint of his usual confidence returning. "Rather imperfectly, I fear, but with complete sincerity." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. "I even have a ring, if you're inclined to accept." Florence felt joy rising within her, not erasing her grief but existing alongside it, proof that the human heart had capacity for both. "Yes," she said simply, "I accept." Jack's smile was radiant as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "She would have loved you as much as I do." Florence touched the ring reverently, then cupped Jack's face between her hands. "I love you, Jackson Aldridge. You gave me back my faith in humanity when I thought it was lost forever." Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of deeper passion to come but respectful of the boarding house setting, and Mrs. Mather's undoubtedly watchful presence just beyond the parlor door. When they parted, Jack remained kneeling before her, his expression thoughtful. "There's something else I want to discuss with you about your land. I haven't sold it yet," Florence told him, though the railway company's offer was generous. "I know," Jack said, "because I advised them on the price." He took her hands again. "Florence, I don't want you to sell your land unless it's truly what you want. Your father had a vision for that property, and perhaps parts of it could still be realized." Florence frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "The railway needs only a portion of your land for the crossing at Rattlesnake Creek," Jack explained. "The rest could still be developed as your father planned, perhaps not for cotton, but for other crops suited to the climate. With proper irrigation from the creek, it could become productive farmland." Hope flickered in Florence's chest. "You think that's possible? With the right investment and expertise, yes," Jack confirmed. "I've spoken with agricultural experts in San Francisco. They believe the land has potential, especially with railway access to markets." Florence considered this possibility, honoring her father's dream while building something new with the man she loved. "Would we live there, on the homestead?" Jack squeezed her hands gently. "If that's what you want. We could rebuild the cabin, make it a proper home, or we could live in town and develop the land as a business venture. The choice is yours, ours." "Ours," Florence repeated, liking the sound of it. I think I'd like to rebuild, not exactly as it was that belongs to the past, but something new on the same foundation." She met Jack's gaze, seeing understanding there. "A place where we can honor what came before while creating our own future." "Then that's what we'll do," Jack promised. Together, Mrs. Mathers could contain her curiosity no longer. She bustled into the parlor with a tea tray, her eyes immediately fixing on Florence's ringed hand. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed with transparent delight. "Is that what I think it is?" Jack rose to his feet, helping Florence up beside him. "Mrs. Mathers, I'm pleased to inform you that Miss Taylor has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." The landlady's squeal of excitement brought Lucia rushing in from the front hall, where she had apparently been waiting for news. "She said yes?" she demanded, grinning when Florence nodded. "Of course she did. Jack may be many things, but a fool isn't one of them." News of their engagement spread through Agua Caliente with the speed only a small town could achieve. By evening, well-wishers were stopping by the boarding house with congratulations and small gifts. Father Ignacio arrived to offer his blessing and discuss arrangements for the ceremony, which Florence and Jack decided would be held in 4 weeks' time. "Not too hasty, but no point in delay either," Jack reasoned. "Unless you'd prefer a longer engagement," Florence shook her head. "No, we've faced death together. I think we can handle marriage without an extended courtship." The following weeks passed in a flurry of preparations. Jack and Florence rode out to the homestead several times, planning the new house that would rise from the ashes of the old. Together, they visited Henry Taylor's grave, where Florence introduced her fiancé and shared their plans for the land. "He would have liked you," she told Jack as they stood by the simple marker. "Not at first, probably he was protective of his only daughter, but he would have respected your integrity." "I wish I could have known him," Jack replied sincerely. "The man who raised such an extraordinary woman must have been remarkable himself." The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the church filled to capacity by townspeople who had come to regard Florence's story as a symbol of justice and resilience. She wore a gown of ivory silk that Lucia and Mrs. Mathers had helped her select, with her mother's locket around her neck and wildflowers in her hair. Jack waited at the altar, his expression transforming from solemn to awestruck as Florence walked toward him on Judge Foster's arm. The judge, who had delayed his return to his regular circuit to attend the wedding, had offered to give her away in the absence of her father. "Who gives this woman in marriage?" Father Ignacio asked as part of the ceremony. "She gives herself," Judge Foster replied, departing from tradition in a way that made Florence smile through her tears. "I merely have the honor of escorting her." Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promising partnership as well as love, respect alongside passion, friendship as the foundation for their shared life. When Jack slipped the wedding band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, Florence felt a sense of completeness that transcended the joy of the moment, as if the scattered pieces of her life were finally falling into their proper places. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Father Ignacio declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The celebration afterwards spilled from the church into the street, the entire town seeming to participate in their happiness. There was music and dancing, food and drink, laughter and a few sentimental tears from those who remembered Florence's arrival in Agua Caliente just a few months earlier, a desperate young woman with nothing left but her determination. As evening approached, Jack and Florence slipped away from the festivities, boarding the waiting carriage that would take them to the newly completed first floor of their homestead. The rest of the house was still under construction, but the essential living quarters were finished, a wedding gift from the townsfolk who had contributed labor, materials, and furnishings. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer the hotel in Phoenix for our wedding night?" Jack asked as they rode through the gathering dusk. "The homestead is still rather primitive." Florence leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible after the tragedy that had brought them together. "I'm sure. This is where our life together begins, where we build something lasting from what was lost." Their arrival at the homestead coincided with sunset, painting the new structure in hues of gold and rose. Though simpler than the house Jack could have afforded to build, it embodied their shared vision, sturdy, practical, but with touches of beauty in the wide windows and covered porch. Jack lifted Florence from the carriage, carrying her across the threshold as tradition demanded. Inside, the main room was warm and welcoming, a fire already burning in the stone hearth courtesy of ranch hands who had ridden ahead to prepare for their arrival. "Welcome home, Mrs. Aldridge," Jack said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Florence looked up at him, this man who had found her in the desert and helped her rebuild her life in more ways than one. "They took everything," she whispered, echoing the despair she had felt on that terrible day. Jack's eyes grew tender as he understood her reference. "Not your worth," he replied, framing her face between his hands. "I see that still shining brighter than ever." Their kiss sealed the promise of their vows, passion mingling with tenderness as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky outside. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, two souls forged in adversity, united in love, building a future on the foundation of their shared past. 5 years later, the morning sun slanted through the curtains of the master bedroom, waking Florence from a peaceful sleep. Beside her, Jack still slumbered, one arm thrown protectively over her even in sleep. She studied his face in the golden light, the lines around his eyes slightly deeper than when they'd met, the occasional strand of silver in his brown hair, but the same strength and kindness in his features. Careful not to wake him, Florence slipped from the bed and donned her robe. Their 5th wedding anniversary was approaching, and with it, the completion of the railway spur line that would connect their thriving farm directly to the main route through Agua Caliente. She moved quietly through the house, much expanded from that first simple structure, and paused at the door to the nursery. Inside, their 3-year-old son Henry slept soundly, his dark hair tousled against the pillow. In the cradle beside his bed, 6-month-old Elizabeth made soft cooing sounds as she woke, her blue eyes so like her father's, focusing on Florence with recognition and delight. "Good morning, sweet girl," Florence whispered, lifting the baby into her arms. "Shall we let your brother sleep a bit longer?" Carrying Elizabeth, she continued downstairs to begin breakfast preparations. The house was larger now, with plenty of room for their growing family and the frequent visitors from town. The main parlor displayed photographs chronicling their life together, their wedding day, the first harvest from their revitalized farm, Henry's birth, and most recently, Elizabeth's christening with Lucia and her husband Miguel as godparents. Jack appeared in the kitchen doorway as Florence was setting the coffee to boil, Elizabeth contentedly playing with a wooden spoon in her lap. "I woke and found my wife missing," he said, crossing to kiss Florence good morning, a distressing way to start the day. Florence smiled up at him, still feeling the same flutter in her heart that his presence had always caused. "I thought you deserved to sleep in. The railway representatives are coming today to finalize the spur line arrangements, and you were up late reviewing the contracts." Jack lifted Elizabeth from her lap, the baby gurgling happily at her father's attention. "A minor sacrifice. The spur line will transform our operation direct shipment to markets in California and beyond." He settled into a chair, bouncing Elizabeth on his knee. "Your grandfather's vision realized beyond his wildest dreams, isn't it, little one?" The past 5 years had seen the Taylor Aldridge homestead grow from a simple farm to a significant agricultural enterprise. The irrigation system Jack had helped design diverted water from Rattlesnake Creek to support not cotton as Henry Taylor had planned, but orchards of fruit trees specially selected for the arid climate and fields of drought-resistant grains. Their success had inspired others in the region to adopt similar methods, gradually transforming the landscape around Agua Caliente. The town itself had prospered with the railway, growing from a dusty outpost to a respectable community with a school, a proper courthouse, and even a small theater where traveling companies sometimes performed. "Papa, Mama." Henry's voice preceded the patter of small feet as their son raced into the kitchen, still in his nightclothes. "Is today the train day?" Jack laughed, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair with his free hand. "Not quite yet, son. The men who build the trains are coming to talk about where our spur line will go." Henry's face fell momentarily, then brightened. "Can I show them where it should go? I've been thinking about it." Florence exchanged an amused glance with Jack. Their son had inherited his grandfather's entrepreneurial spirit and his father's methodical approach to problem-solving, a combination that kept them constantly on their toes. "Perhaps," Florence allowed, "but first, breakfast in proper clothes." As she prepared the meal, Florence reflected on how fully their life had realized the vision she and Jack had shared on their wedding day. The homestead had indeed become a place that honored the past while embracing the future, a legacy for their children that encompassed both Henry Taylor's dreams and their own. There had been challenges, of course. The first year had brought drought that threatened their initial plantings. The second saw a dispute with neighboring ranchers over water rights that required Jack's diplomatic skills to resolve. The birth of Henry had been difficult, leaving Florence bedridden for weeks afterward. But through it all, their partnership had remained strong, each supporting the other, finding solutions together, celebrating successes and weathering setbacks as one. The railway representatives arrived mid-morning, 3 men in business suits, who seemed impressed by the operation Jack and Florence had built. Henry, true to his word, had prepared a carefully drawn map showing where he thought the spur line should go, complete with a loading dock positioned for maximum efficiency. "Your son has a future in railway planning, Mr. Aldridge," the lead representative commented with a smile as he examined Henry's drawing. "His proposal is remarkably similar to what our engineers recommended." Florence watched proudly as Jack included Henry in the discussions, explaining each aspect of the plans in terms the boy could understand while still addressing the representative's technical questions. It was this balance, respecting children's intelligence while guiding their understanding, that made Jack such a wonderful father. After the meeting concluded successfully and the representatives departed, Jack found Florence in her garden, where she was gathering vegetables for dinner while Elizabeth napped in a shaded basket nearby. Henry's already planning the first shipment we'll send on his railway, Jack reported with amusement. I believe he intends to ride along with it all the way to San Francisco. Florence laughed, rising from her task to embrace her husband. Your son is nothing if not ambitious. Our son, Jack corrected, his arms tightening around her. Though I see more of you in him every day, that unwavering determination once he sets his mind to something. They stood together in the garden they had created from barren soil, surrounded by the fruits of their labor, both literal and figurative. Beyond the garden lay orchards, fields, and the new railway spur that would soon connect their vision to the wider world. Did you ever imagine this? Florence asked, gesturing to encompass their home, their land, the life they had built. That day when you found me half dead in the desert, Jack's expression grew thoughtful. Not specifically this, he admitted. But I knew from that first moment that you were extraordinary, a woman who had faced the worst and refused to surrender. His smile was tender as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I think part of me began loving you even then. Florence leaned into his embrace, gratitude and love welling up within her. They took everything, she repeated, the words no longer carrying pain but serving as a reminder of how far they had come. Except what mattered most, your worth, Jack finished softly. That still shines brighter than anything in our home, our children, everything you touch. He kissed her forehead gently. It always will. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Florence reflected that perhaps her father had been right all along. He had brought her to Arizona territory searching for a place to put down roots, a chance to build something lasting. Though the path had been different than either of them could have imagined, his dream had ultimately been realized. In the loss of everything, she had found something greater, not just survival, but a life rich with purpose, love, and hope. A legacy that would continue through their children and the land they had reclaimed from tragedy. And with each passing day, that legacy grew stronger, a testament to the enduring power of courage, justice, and love in the wild heart of the American West.